After exploring the writings of German philosophers and getting perspectives from the United States and Europe, we're taking a trip to the Middle East. Welcome to Cairo, Egypt. With more than 20 million residents, more than doubling the population of New York City, this massive city is an epicenter of the Middle East. But what does its social infrastructure look like? And how does that connect to the gender roles found in Egypt? Through a series of visits and reflection, anthropologist Julia Elyachar has tackled this exact issue. Throughout her ethnography, she specifically takes a look at how women's practices of sociality affect the entire social infrastructure of the city, state, and the Middle East in general, investigating the implications of promoting women's empowerment throughout the city. So first she looks into the pushes for women's empowerment by Usted Ahmed, who is the president of a local NGO, and talks about how even after she came back a decade later, that empowerment didn't seem to really be taking shape. At least not in the form that many were striving for. Elyachar does mention that maybe it's just because it's in such a big city, it's hard to get real change to happen. Or potentially it was all trickery and it was just done to look good in the public eye. But rather than looking if it was a success or a failure, she takes a different approach, going as far as to say that the movement's primary mission wasn't to change women's lives, but empower their social practices. Well, she combines the phrase Phatic union, created in 1936 by Malinowski, and Marx's definition of labor to create something she calls Phatic labor. And this brings an entire new framework to look at labor itself. Rather than the basic structure defined by others, where basic labor power would either be sold for a wage or be put into recreating oneself, it takes on a much more social implication. She uses the example of coffee houses in Cairo, showing that they are the epicenter of social interaction, business deals, and negotiation. Focusing on the wife of a coffee house owner, showing that she was really the one that maintained that social infrastructure, describing how she really had to work to maintain her husband's reputation. And she also uses another example where this same principle comes into play, where change could only happen if this person knew somebody in the organization she was approaching. So essentially, this labor entirely revolves around connection and can be explicitly seen in the work that goes into forming a network of people. In fact, Elyachar even mentions that she doesn't describe a network as an interlocking web of individuals, but rather an outcome of these social practices and individual relationships being facilitated for essential business purposes. So while the other forms of labor were to produce a physical product or physical result, this view is way more about building up social relations that then can help somebody grow their business or do their work and then produce something like money. So the entire script of labor is totally flipped here. Okay, so it makes sense, but it kind of sounds like somebody is just taking advantage of the social system. In fact, she even compares this to the term nepotism, which inherently has a negative connotation. But is this idea of labor really just a way to excuse corrupt relationships where people exploit others they know for financial or economic gain? Well, I don't think that's what she was trying to implicate here. Rather than something like affective labor or just blatant nepotism where somebody is chosen because of the relationship they have and there's an understood outcome that will definitely happen because they made this choice, this Phatic labor simply creates the mediation, the channel for communication to happen. So there is never a guarantee of an outcome. Even things like just being a nice person could be seen as Phatic labor, because then that would mean that others would perceive you as somebody they want to connect with. That would form that connection and therefore be something that could be used in the future. But Elyachar does clarify that just having friendly relationships doesn't mean that it's just always opportunistic functionalism where you're looking for something no matter what you're doing, but more inherits Malinowski's views from the 20s and 30s, where he explains that every utterance is an act when chatting with somebody, and that language isn't just a form of reflecting on something, but actually a mode of action. So even if it's not even purposeful, speech that gives you individuality that, like Hannah Arendt talked about, is gonna inherently facilitate relationships. So by putting in this Phatic labor, you're not directly producing capital, you're just creating something that allows for the flow of information, or even more importantly, reputation and emotion, similar to affective labor that capitalizes on family ethos. But then after that can create something like financial capital or something that will be used in a more physical sense. I think the most important part about this, though, is kind of brought up by Bourdieu. When he describes the beaten tracks to describe practical reasoning, he really goes into how those have to be frequently used and maintained. And that is where the similarity comes into play here. The Phatic labor is definitely not temporary, because similar to what Arendt looked at, it's a constant cycle. While you can start tons of different relationships, none of of them are really going to be valuable or produce value later if you don't maintain those relationships. And plus, you don't want to look suspicious. It's all about creating those channels of communication that will really produce something in the future. It's a long and laborious process that actually takes time. There's not really a very clear outcome of what you're striving for. It's more of just a generalized disposition to create those channels and maintain them in the future, which specifically in Cairo have seemingly become a commodity themselves, and they can now be viewed as direct economic import because of the changes that they're causing in the social structure and even financial structure of Cairo and Egypt in general. And I love how she ends this piece by saying that the future of this topic really remains to be seen. Because as you can see with her account of the groundbreaking internet banking transfers, things move really quickly. The population is still rapidly expanding there, and nothing is ever gonna just be stagnant there. Since it's so different from those neoclassical definitions of labor, it's gonna be really interesting to see how it evolves in the future. Thanks for watching.